like today to welcome not only the Friends of Air Force History and Heritage, but also the Friends of Stalag Luft III and members of the Civil Aviation Historical Society, some of whom are here today. Firstly, though, as Group Captain Fredo said, just a few Zoom housekeeping arrangements. As he said, we will be recording it today, recording the session today. Also ask that you turn your audio to mute to cut out any background noise. And if you have a tendency to fidget or want to slip off for a cup of coffee, or if you, like me, have pets that like to join in occasionally to the Zoom meetings, I just ask that that perhaps just turn off your screens and turn your screens off as well. Thank you. The format today will be as usual. I'll introduce our guest speaker. The presentation will be approximately 40 to 50 minutes, followed by a question and answer session, and I'll moderate the Q&A. As Fredo said, this is the last presentation for the year, and it's a presentation I'm particularly looking forward to hearing myself, having had the great privilege to attend the 75th anniversary of the Great Escape in Zargan. I'm really looking forward to this. The thunder's been taken a little bit away, but first of all, before I even start to talk about our guest speaker, I'd like to extend my congratulations from Dr. Whiting to Dr. Kristen Alexander, who's just recently been awarded her PhD. So please join me in congratulating her.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. I know how wonderful this feels when it's all off your shoulders. So
yes,
well done, Kristen. So she'll be very proud of your efforts. Just talking about Dr. Alexander, she has to get used to that. She's that being called that. She is an adjunct associate lecturer at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. She's written 5 books on Australian history, including Clive Corbell, Air Race, and Australia's Few and the Battle of Britain. These 2 books have been included in the Royal Australian Air Force's Chief of Air Force recommended reading list. And she's currently working on her 6th book based on her thesis. So that'll be a book which I think will be a terrific bestseller. And of course the PhD covers the experience of Australian airmen who were prisoners in Stalag Luft III and their families. As I said, the presentation today, this will be a really interesting one. As the presentation slide you can see there, it's winning the Battle of the Wits, the barbed wire battleground of the Australian airmen of Stalag Luft III. Dr. Alexander's presentation will be how the prisoners overcame the challenges of captivity to remain active servicemen in this barbed wire battleground, how they reinforced their military identity, enacting Royal Air Force discipline and engaging in a program of active disruption, including, as we know, escape. She'll also discuss the narratives of captivity which enable the Australian airmen to make sense of the deaths of those killed in the Great Escape reprisals. Without further ado, I now have great pleasure of handing over to Kristen and looking forward to your presentation, Doctor. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. And thanks to everyone for logging on for today's session. It's good to see so many of you. And I'd especially like to thank the members of the extended Stalag Luft III family for coming along. Many of you contributed to my research, for which I'm truly grateful. Thank you. And now I'll begin, but please forgive my attempts at dodgy German. Air power underpinned Second World War victory. Australian airmen in operations rooms, aircraft, and in ground support played a considerable role in achieving tactical and strategic success. If captured, however, downed airmen were generally perceived as being out of action. But that was not always the case. Today, I'll discuss how the Australian airmen of Stalag Luft III, a Luftwaffe prisoner of war camp located in the German province of Lower Silesia, energetically continued to fulfill their service duties. Drawing on official records as well as airmen's wartime writings, post-war interviews, memoirs, and medical testimony, I'll discuss how the Australian airmen overcame the challenges of captivity to remain active servicemen in the barbed wire battleground. They did this by reinforcing their military identity, implementing RAF discipline, and acting disruptively. I will also discuss the narratives they constructed, which enabled them to make sense of their captivity, as well as the deaths of those killed in the Great Escape reprisals. 351 Australian airmen were imprisoned in Stalag Luft III at some point between its April 1942 opening and the January 1945 evacuation, approximately a quarter of all Australian airmen prisoners in Europe. Many of those downed airmen spoke of the shock of captivity, the shame they felt on capture, and their abhorrence of the stigma associated with being a prisoner of war. Their sense of disgrace was exacerbated when they heard the usual taunt, "For Sie, the Krieg ist beendet." For you, the war is over. Captivity was a serious blow to self-esteem and service pride. But rather than accept a situation defined by passivity and docility, they rejected it. As one airman put it, capture merely changed the nature of my participation in the war. All British-based personnel had been briefed that if captured, airmen were still members of the Air Force, and as such, they had to adhere to the Air Force Act. There was an obligation of duty not to give any information in order to protect Air Force security. Many airmen had also viewed the 1940 training film Enemy Interrogation of Prisoners, which detailed the tricks the Germans might deploy to gain intelligence. It also indicated how the newly captured should conduct themselves, revealed the consequences of disobeying RAF orders and procedure, and stressed that they were still duty-bound to follow RAF protocol. Both film and their duties under the Air Force Act reinforced the onus of Air Force discipline and continuing service. They may have been prisoners, but they were still considered to be on active duty, albeit behind barbed wire. At Stalag Luft, the Luftwaffe's central interrogation facility, prisoners found polite, seemingly friendly and courteous German examiners who attempted to build rapport by cajoling with cigarettes and bonhomie. Interrogators tried to unsettle the airmen, showing them dossiers of press clippings, photographs and maps, as well as squadron histories and comprehensive lists of personnel. More than one man was rattled. One nearly fell over when his interrogator started speaking about the RAF's still experimental H2S radar display equipment. The airmen tried to resist German trickery. Rex Austin was unfailingly polite to his interrogators. "I'm sorry, sir, I'm not permitted to say." Justin O'Byrne recounted that he evaded every leading question, and whenever there was a lull in conversation, I enlarged on the advantages of using Deboric, the boracic glycerin treatment for blowfly strike on sheep. When the soft touch and displays of intelligence already gathered failed to overcome the airmen's commitment to reticence, the interrogator's demeanour changed. After about 2 hours of O'Byrne's sales talk, the German threatened the Australian. "I would never see any of my friends and relations again if I did not give the information they wanted." I told him that was just too bad, and he stormed out and slammed the door. One interrogator became coldly stern and raving later on. Cy Borschts hit him on the back of the head, lightly at first, and then increasingly harder. Finally, in the face of Borscht's continuing resistance to questioning, the interrogator played the Jew card, threatening to hand the Jewish airman over to the Gestapo. Others were subject to heat treatment in their cells. Some were tortured. prisoners drew on their inner strengths. Justin O'Byrne evaded every leading question to gain the upper hand. When Doug Hutchinson's silence failed, his interrogator aggravated a foot wound. Despite pain and discomfort, Hutchinson's continued to resist. He tried to be smarter all the time. So too did Cy Borscht. It was just simply a matter of repeating what you've already told him. Rex Austin focused his anger on the mongrel fleas attacking him and refused to be humiliated by solitary confinement and the insanitary conditions of his cell. Richard Wynne composed rhyming poetry in his head. He also carried out some self-serving sabotage. Rather than put up with an unbearably hot room, he disconnected one of the heater's electrical wires with his identity disc and manipulated his fountain pen barrel to turn the heater on and off. Kenneth Galton alleviated the worst effects of the heat torture by rubbing his handkerchief on the early morning condensation and later urinating on it to just wet my lips. That was the way I beat the system in my mind. The Australians continued to act smarter when they arrived at their permanent POW camps. They did away with the German designation of their captive state, Kriegsgefangener, which means war prisoner, because of the negative and ignominious connotations surrounding the word prisoner and its associated trappings of captivity, such as POW number, fingerprinting, and prisoner identity discs. They collectively adopted the easier to pronounce abbreviation of Kriegi, derived from the first syllable, the German word for war. In doing so, they removed the sense of derogation surrounding captivity and turned an affront into a linguistic badge of inclusiveness and pride. Kriegi declared that they were still men of war on operational service. The Kriegies institutionalized Air Force discipline in the camp. Stalag Luft III was organized as far as possible along RAF station lines. Camp and compound command structures were implemented. Accommodation blocks were run like squadrons with their own commanding officers known as blockheads. Prisoner committees coordinated entertainment, education, sports, and leisure pursuits. As at any training station, men were encouraged to participate. RAF discipline engendered a vital esprit de corps. It was essential for the airmen prisoners' physical and psychological well-being. It also afforded them the support they needed to act disruptively against the Germans. Soon after settling in, the airmen were addressed by the senior British officer. His first words, Bruce Lumsden recalled, were clearly intended to galvanize us out of any apathy and meet resignation to our fate. Reappropriating the oft-repeated German refrain, the group captain announced, as though giving an order, that for you, the war is not over. While Lumsden and his fellow newsboys were to stop short of acts of overt disobedience which could be punished, they were warned against any degree of compliance or cooperation with the Germans beyond what was necessary. Most emphatically, the SBO instilled in them that it was our duty to make the enemy's task of imprisoning us as difficult and demanding on resources as we could. Lumsden and his friends soon learned some of the ways by which this could be done. They collectively demonstrated to the Germans that, as Alec Arnell put it, you have us here, but we're not going to let you walk all over us. Accordingly, they used whatever means they had. The Kriegies welcomed their duty of active disruption. The Kriegies' commandments, among other things, exhorted them to do no Arbeit, work, and to get into as many rackets as possible. Other disruptive acts included the fierce joy of goon baiting, where they either individually or in concert provoked the German prison staff. Some teased the guard dogs. Some broke rules, such as those who played cards in other rooms out of hours. Roll call was disorderly and covertly defiant. Smoking on parade especially annoyed the Germans, as it was unsoldatlich, unsoldierly behaviour. They relished their non-cooperative and aggressive stance. At every opportunity, the men purloined German tools and supplies. They suborned and bribed the guards, demonstrating ingenuity as well as technical expertise. Some Kriegies constructed, maintained, and stole parts for radios. Others distributed transcripts from BBC news broadcasts to boost morale. North Compound's gossipy Scangriff undermined German superiority. "We always used to put a lot of garbage in it, so they never knew what was true," recalled Bill Fordyce, one of the newsletter's contributors. The Kriegies delighted in demoralizing the guards and whenever possible would declare Deutschland kaputt. As 1944 drew to a close, the German capitulation seemed likely. Group Captain Douglas Wilson, the ranking Australian and sometimes senior British officer, organised commando training to overpower the Germans and take control of the camp if an opportunity arose. Their disruptiveness did not go unpunished. Roll calls took longer. The airmen were made to stand on parade for hours in inclement weather or long into the night. They were put in the cooler or confined to barracks. Red Cross parcels and mail were withheld. Some Kriegies suffered violence. One, for instance, was hit by a German rifle butt on the spine and was completely paralysed for 2 days. On 2 occasions, he was interrogated by the Gestapo, and during one of them was threatened with death. Intimidations, injuries, and collective sanctions did little to dent their ardour. Rather than unsoldatlich behaviour, it was something they revelled in. "Never during the whole of the war did I stop sticking my neck out," one man declared 40 years later. As Justin O'Byrne recounted, their active disruption and resistance was all part of showing that there was a fight in the British, including the Australian airmen, as much as ever there was. Disruptive acts lifted morale and strengthened group cohesion. They shored up the Kriegies' martial identity as on-duty airmen in the barbed-wire battleground. This, in retrospect, was validated by Stalag Luft III's former commandant, who acknowledged that the British, again including the Australians, were the most offensive prisoners against the Germans. In his history of the Australian Air War in Europe, John Harrington recorded that airmen prisoners had a moral right and duty to escape if they could. Escape was formally institutionalized within Stalag Luft III as the major expression of active disruption. But did the Kriegies have a duty to escape? Planning for eventual conflict, the RAF issued in March 1936 Air Publication 1548, which provided guidance on what could be divulged to the enemy on capture, intelligence the enemy would try to extract, and the techniques they might deploy in doing so, and a list of don'ts. While it did not impose a duty to escape, it urged an escape awareness. The RAF did not update Air Publication 1548 at the outbreak of war. However, given advice that opportunities for escape will present themselves and the exhortation to keep your eyes and ears open for any information which you think may be of value should you succeed in escaping, some of the earliest captive airmen inferred an onus to escape. The duty to escape was formalised in the June 1941 edition. The escape rationale was also defined. Attempts have a very appreciable nuisance value. The duty was rescinded in April 1944, but as in the original booklet, an implied duty was urged by encouraging an alertness to escape. The revision was a response to heightened security within Germany because of the perceived threat posed by Allied prisoners of war. In mid-September 1944, the Germans spelled out the ramifications of escape in a circular addressed to all prisoners of war, which declared that escape from prison camp is no longer a sport. Absconders captured in newly designated death zones would be immediately shot on sight. So the duty to escape was not a constant. It changed over time from escape awareness and inferred duty to a stated duty, and then to an implied duty. In recollection, however, it was propounded as an unwavering, ever-present obligation. But according to Jock Bryce in 1946, few airmen captives were interested in the duty to escape. So if not duty, what did motivate them? While Justin O'Byrne stated that his first duty was to escape, to try to rejoin his lines, he also claimed other reasons, including self-esteem, to get out of a tedious environment, the challenge, and being a hindrance to the Germans who had to smarten up their method of surveillance to cope with them. For Paul Royal, it was nothing more than self-interest. We only thought of ourselves getting out. Multiple escaper Alex Kerr was drawn to the adventure, combined with potential freedom. He felt triumph and excitement when he and his companions had to live on their wits while on the run. It was an exhilarating feeling knowing you were winning a dangerous cat and mouse game with the threat of disaster if you lost. The adrenaline was coursing through your veins continuously. Emotions underpinned some escape bids. Jock Bryce recognised that for some, the misery of confinement and homesickness for one's friends were incentives as strong as any. Albert Hake missed his wife so much, he only wanted to return to her. Many felt ashamed that they had been captured, such as James Catanach. My arrival in enemy territory was far from glorious, he confessed. I force landed as a result of fuel shortage caused by a sequence of misfortunes, mostly due to my own foolishness. Recollections of it all gets me down. It seems Jock Bryce was probably right. There were many motivations precipitating escape, and few of them related entirely to duty, if at all. Stalag Luft III's escape efforts were officially coordinated by the X organisation. Australians participated in almost every aspect of it. The majority joined the army of watchers known as stooges, who kept a lookout for any sign of the Germans while others carried out covert work. Heck Henry was one who helped make dummy rifles. He modelled his section in soap, then used silver paper and other oddments to complete it. Tony Gordon did metal work and was one of those tasked with constructing and maintaining a secret radio. Some, like Ted Ernge, were in charge of block security. They crawled under huts and through ceilings to detect German listening devices. Albert Hake was the chief compass maker. John Williams and Reg Keirith were involved in the carpentry department. Williams, the chief supply officer and head carpenter, was responsible for appropriating 4,000-odd bedboards, which were used to shore up the tunnels. Keirith helped build a network of false walls behind which were stashed forged documents and other items vital for the escape, such as Hake's compasses. Scroungers obtained ink, radio parts, and essential supplies. Photographers took passport photos. Forgers replicated passes and identification papers. Rosters were drawn up disguised as participants' lists for sports days, and sporty types created diversions. Tunnellers dug, penguins carted dirt away hidden under trouser legs, and gardeners disposed of it. So industrious were the tunnellers that in East Compound alone, between 60 and 70 tunnels were started during the first 6 months. Despite such prolific excavation, East Compound's only successful getaway was October 1943's Wooden Horse effort, where 3 men made a home run to England. None were Australians, but they had a number of key roles. Jock McKechnie helped fabricate the vaulting horse. Australians took turns jumping over it to distract the guards while tunnellers worked underneath. Another Australian slept in the bed of one of the escapers to cover up his absence on the night of the prison break. If the escape route hadn't been discovered, another was in the next batch of prisoners hoping to use the tunnel. Although the X organisation spawned many escape attempts, Stalag Luft III is renowned for North Compound's most notorious scheme. Roger Bushell, who was recognised as being obsessed with escape, autocratically exercised total control of the X organisation. He forbade all but authorised escape plans. 4 Australians who ignored the rules felt his ire. They were given a good talking to, and now as punishment, we have to dig rubbish tips. They were forbidden another attempt and promised it wouldn't happen again. Shortly after North Compound opened in March 1943, Bushell implemented plans for a mass escape. The POWs dug 3 tunnels, which were known as Tom, Dick, and Harry. One was discovered by the Germans, another was decommissioned, and Harry remained the focus of the tunnellers' attention. 200 men tried to escape on the night of the 24th, 25th of March, 1944. 6 Australians were among the 76 who tunnelled out. Bill Fordyce was still in the tunnel when the attempt was discovered. Many others, including Justin O'Byrne, had been awaiting their chance. Only 3 airmen made it back to Britain. 73 were recaptured, including Paul Royal. While he was later returned to Stalag Luft III, 50 airmen were shot in the post-escape reprisals. I'm going to leave the escapers for the moment and jump ahead to June 1945. Shortly arriving back in the UK, the newly liberated Terence officer declared nearly 100% commitment to escape among the Australians. The names of POWs who have tried to escape, and even those who temporarily escaped, as he had, include almost everyone at some time. Such a grand claim. But did almost every Australian attempt to escape? And what are the rest of Stalag Luft III's Kriegies? Well, MI9's historians certainly deemed Stalag Luft III an escape-minded camp, and that is the common perception. But let's look closely at officers' claim. After the war, involvement in the X organisation was recorded as an officially endorsed, valuable aspect of the camp community. Terence officer implies only a handful did not participate. So too does George Harsh, an American serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force who was North Compound security officer and a member of the X organisation's executive committee. One-time senior British officer Harry Wings Day assessed that 5% were dedicated escapers who would willingly accept any risk, fanatics who thought, dreamed and talked of nothing else. He considered that 20% were hard-working escapers who kept up a consistent escape effort, even as they contributed to camp life generally. The majority, in his opinion, would only escape if the opportunity was presented to them. They, however, were happy to join the X organisation and help those who were eager to escape. Only a small minority, Day claimed, did not attempt to escape in any circumstance or participate in the escape organisation. Despite the assertions of Officer, Harsh and Day, Aidan Crawley, the official historian of the RAF's war escapes, states that only about 2/3 of North Compound registered for the escape organisation. 1/3 did not. Who is right? Well, not Terence officer, Harsh or Day. I don't know about Crawley, but he's closer to the mark. Officer's statement of almost everyone at some time is one of the earliest iterations of Stalag Luft III's myth of near universal escape participation. Australian evidence, however, contradicts that myth. After liberation, former Kriegies were asked to state circumstances and details of any escape. This is where I found Terence officers almost everyone at some time claim. Not all of the Australian debriefs are extant, but in the 295 I consulted, written by 85% of Stalag Luft III's post-war Australian survivors, only 28% of the former Kriegies recorded escape-related work. Even when I looked at the full range of available evidence for the 351 Australian airmen, only about a quarter recorded escape attempts or escape-related work. Those men participated in all facets of the escape organisation. As you can see from these and other slides I've used, Australian artist Albert Comber recorded some of the covert operations in a collection of artwork commissioned by the Australian War Memorial shortly after the war. An assertion of almost 100% commitment could only be a complete, though perhaps well-meaning, exaggeration. Not every Kriegi could attempt escape. Suggesting a valid basis for non-participation, the majority of reasons for non-involvement relate to changed circumstances after the Great Escape, pragmatism, and the physical and psychological states of some of the airmen. 21% of the Australians were captured after the Great Escape. 5% of those had been taken after the duty to escape had been formally rescinded, so were not obliged to adhere to it. Nor were those already imprisoned who had been advised of the changed situation via coded message. Many of the long-term prisoners heeded the new instructions. Escape was nothing now more than wishful thinking. While a fourth tunnel, dubbed George, was started in about September 1944, it was more a contingency tunnel used for storing weapons and escape items in case the Germans turned on them as the Russian army advanced. Very few knew about it. Some of the newly captured considered they had already fulfilled their operational duty. Captivity was their equivalent of tour expired. For Alec Arnell, who had been downed on the 29th of June 1944, there was no point at that stage in being heroic. I'd had enough of the war anyway. I'd had over 4 years of frontline service, and I was tired, awfully tired of the war. So there was some self-interest in that I wasn't going to do anything dramatic unless the opportunity came. Arnell was not alone. It was pretty well the attitude of the people in the camp at the time. There's not much point us doing anything at the moment. As 1944 advanced, Arnell's reluctance to escape firmed into a survival instinct. I'm going to survive and keep trying to survive. Indeed, not too many stuck their head out at that stage, Arnell recalled, because we weren't going to help win the war. The war-weary attitude, however, did not stop their unsoldatlich behaviour. Some, like Paul Brickell, were not psychologically fit. He was just one who reluctantly gave up tunnelling because of his crippling claustrophobia. Some men were not physically capable, including those who were temporarily or permanently debilitated during their last op, bailouts, aircraft crashes, or the unhealthy conditions they were exposed to on the run or during captivity. One man was hospitalised for 2 months after 2nd and 3rd degree burns, which required a skin graft. Another spent 4 months in hospital for his knee, which took 18 months to heal, just as he was liberated. Nor were those who were medically repatriated likely to have been involved in escape work. None of the 9 Australian airmen who had transferred from Buchenwald concentration camp were fit enough for an escape attempt, including Eric Johnston, who drew the image currently on screen. One had rheumatism in knees and hip when he arrived at Saigon, and by the time he was liberated, had lost almost 32 kilograms from his enlistment weight. Earlier bad experiences on the run perhaps deterred others. Of the 10 men who made in-transit dashes and camp breakouts before arriving at Stalag Luft III, none tried again. One was in such a bad state he was in hospital for 10 days. Near-universal escape participation may be a myth, but it was an important narrative which enabled former Kriegis to collectively look back on their disruptive actions with pride. Regardless of personal motivation, the obligation of Air Force duty, which underpinned active disruption and escape, provided a legitimate mechanism to make sense of perhaps the greatest tragedy of their captivity, the deaths of 50 airmen, including 5 Australians. Before I tell you how the airmen did that, let us return to the night of the Great Escape. James Cattanar was 23rd out of the tunnel. Travelling by train, he had put about 530 kilometres between him and the camp before he was captured at Flensburg on Germany's border with Denmark. He had been on the run for 45 hours. John Williams, number 32 from the tunnel, and Reg Kirith, the 35th, travelled some of the way together by train and partly by foot. They covered about 80 kilometres and had been out for maybe 16 hours before they were recaptured. Albert Hake was number 70, followed close behind by Tom Lee, who was 73rd. Hake and Lee had no chance of success. They were what the airmen termed hard asses. They had to travel by foot. It is thought that Hake, who suffered excruciating frostbite, travelled perhaps less than 65 kilometres and had been free for about 72 hours before he was captured. No one knows for sure, but it seems Lee had trudged no more than 24 kilometres from the camp, and that he had been free for less than 48 hours. Along with 45 other airmen, including Roger Bushell, those young Australians were shot on Hitler's order. They were all in their 20s. Kirith, the oldest, was 29. The youngest was Katanar. He was 22 years old. Back in the camp, Bill Fordyce and others still in the tunnel when the sirens went off made their way back to the hut. Alan Rigetti, who had been one of the ex-organisation stooges, remembered hearing shots fired. It was pandemonium. All traces of the escape were covered up or destroyed as the Germans searched for signs of a tunnel. Rigetti recalled that we were bitterly disappointed that all the men had not escaped, but at the same time, very proud of the fact that we had the whole of the area and the German army rushing all over the place looking for our fellas. The names of the dead were announced a few days later. Stalag Luft III's airmen felt deep personal loss. They recorded their names in their wartime logbooks and diaries. We were stunned, Justin O'Byrne recalled. We were just so grieved at such a tragedy happening to people who were so young, virile lads in the prime of their lives, and to be shot down, murdered like dogs. It was beyond our comprehension. Communal grief was as stark as any personal bereavement. Individually and as a community, the airmen tried to give the deaths greater meaning. A memorial parade was held in North Compound and the men went into mourning. Every prisoner wore a black diamond on his sleeve for the remainder of our term in prison, recalled O'Byrne. The airmen gathered for photographs on Anzac Day, wearing full uniform, their group portrait declaring more than national and service solidarity. Taken on the day of Australia's most significant commemoration of the war dead, it is a visual record of Air Force pride and collective grief. Graves and memorials provide a tangible connection between the dead and living, a focus for grief, a trigger for remembrance, and a place of pilgrimage. Just as many Great War memorials in Britain and Australia had been voluntarily built by families and communities, North Compound's Air Force family kept faith with their dead when they erected a memorial to the 50 airmen. Designed by Wilton Todd, an Australian-born architect and theatrical designer, the Prisoners' Memorial resembles an altar, a pagan and Christian artifact relating to sacrifice, the sacrificial table. Todd's design included an eagle, its spreading wings symbolizing the brotherhood of airmen and the airmen's wings insignia. The names of the dead are engraved on 3 granite tablets, divided into 6 columns by crosses, which recall Sir Reginald Blomfield's Cross of Sacrifice. Featuring in Imperial War Graves Commission cemeteries, Blomfield's cross, encompassing a battle broadsword, emphasises both the military service and religious backgrounds of the majority of the dead. The broadsword's links to medieval knights and their code of chivalry also has deeper resonance for the members of an air force which aspired to chivalrous values at heart, if not on operations. The memorial's cross signals that Todd and Stalag Luft III's airmen perceived the 50th death as sacrifice. So too does the inscription underneath their names, in memory of the officers who gave their lives. From this, the airmen composed a lasting narrative of sacrifice. Decades after the war, some survivors visited the remnants of Stalag Luft III, the prisoner memorial, and their friends' graves, where their ashes were later buried. Their pilgrimage and tributes were fraternal expressions of love and grief. Justin O'Byrne, then a senator in the Australian Parliament, travelled to Eastern Europe in 1975. It was an official tour, but he wanted to visit the camps in which he had been incarcerated and to retrace my footsteps along that long frozen trek of the forced march. O'Byrne had helped dig Tunnel Harry, had drawn lots for his place in the Great Escape, and had sewn a black mourning patch onto his uniform. He had also helped construct the prisoner's memorial. Returning to that site was for him an intensely affecting experience. Jeff Cornish prepared himself beforehand, hoping to steel himself against the steep psychological challenge of returning to Stalag Luft III. However, when I walked up the line of gravestones, the scenes came flooding back to me. And when I glanced to my left, there was Roger Bushell, James Kavanagh, all the names of very great and very dear friends. I was literally overwhelmed. Reg Giddy, who never forgot the emotional effect of hearing that 50 of his fellow prisoners had been killed, visited Stalag Luft III for the escape's 50th anniversary. He laid flowers on his friends' graves, including Albert Hakes. Such actions provided an opportunity to come to terms with and make sense of their deaths. So too did the narrative of sacrifice, which later merged with that of duty. Their late life recollections, underpinned by various iterations of Air Publication 58, emphasise that 50 airmen had died in service, fulfilling their service and captivity obligations. Lionel Jeffries, one of the Great Escape stooges, asserted that we were duty-bound to escape if we could, reinforcing that they remained active participants in the war behind barbed wire. Many highlighted the nuisance value of escape. They believed they were tying up German manpower and materiel. Bill Fordyce considered the breakout successful, even if it was so tragic. There were tens of thousands of German troops whose sole job was to look for those that escaped, he said. This was our war contribution, Lionel Jeffries stated, to create maximum disruption to Germany in its then failing condition. A narrative of Air Force duty could also abrogate any sense of guilt the survivors may have felt about the deaths of their comrades. And some of those who participated in the Great Escape were troubled in late life by the fact of their survival. Bill Fordyce was unsettled for several years after liberation. He used to dream about the Great Escape for 4 or 5 years after the war, on its anniversary. Paul Royal's escape partner was killed in the reprisals. He did not have a clue as to why he wasn't chosen. Royal could see no reason why one should live and not the other. Jeff Cornish had traded his place in the X organisation with another so he could join the medical staff in Bellaria compound. He claimed he did not regret giving it to one of the 50 they executed and an only son, but guilt niggled. There are a few ghosts in there still, Cornish admitted, as he told of how he squibbed meeting his friends' parents to condole. What do I say to them? I'm glad I took the decision I did. I didn't get shot and your son did. Or I'm sorry that I wasn't shot in his place. Because of decades of lionisation of the participants, there are very few latter-day criticisms of either the escape organisation or its main proponents, particularly Roger Bushell. As time passed, most of Stalag Luft III's former Kriegies forgot or ignored Bushell's escape autocracy. Some acclaimed him a hero. 60 years after Bushell's death, Jeff Cornish still considered the South African to be a very great friend. He was brave and he was cunning. He was the ideal type. Justin O'Byrne's assessment of Bushell is also typical. He was an inspiration for morale building and determination. A very great man. After the war, Australian journalist Paul Brickhill was invited to write a book about the March 1944 escape. That book proved influential in how captivity in Stalag Luft III has been portrayed. It also cemented Bushell's reputation as the ideal type. The mass breakout was not known as the Great Escape until publication of Brickhill's The Great Escape in 1951. From that time, the book's title entered the lexicon as participants, bystanders, and the public all appropriated it to describe an event that still resonates. While many of the former Kriegies were impressed by Brickhill's book, some were not pleased with John Sturgis's 1963 film of the book. Justin O'Byrne thought it was a most terrible adaptation by the Americans. I was absolutely disgusted with them. He considered it a travesty of history. O'Byrne was one of the many who begrudged it the Americans, the motorbike, a fake Australian accent, and other factual inaccuracies inserted in the interests of good cinema. Despite former Kriegies' discomfort, the film and Brickhill's book frame captivity in Stalag Luft III as an action-packed success story which perpetuates the myth of near-universal participation in the famous Great Escape, the greatest prison camp escape of them all. It may have been tragic, but it was not a failure. It was great. Book and film validate and reinforce the Kriegies' narrative of active disruption. So too does the narrative of duty. The glee with which former airmen such as Justin O'Byrne later told stories of prisoners under a great handicap, but often coming out on top, highlights the Kriegies' belief that through their successful disruption, they had won the Battle of the Wits against the Germans in the barbed-wire battleground. The Great Escape may have failed to achieve its aim of creating great havoc. It may have had little effect on the Allied war effort, but the merged narratives of duty and sacrifice gave meaning to the mass breakout, as well as the deaths of the 50 airmen. Leaving aside the tragedy of the Great Escape, so effective was the Kriegies' active disruption that RAAF historian John Harrington formally recognised that they, along with all of Australia's airmen captives, had remained combatants, even as prisoners. As such, the airmen could justifiably revel in their defiant acts. We were the naughty boys, one man proudly declared 4 decades later, and never stopped fighting the Germans in every way we could. Thank you. That's it.
Terrific, terrific. Many thanks, Dr. Alexander. That was absolutely terrific. I particularly enjoyed your analysis of the duty to escape, and the actual, you're right. We have this myth that it was the duty of escape, and everyone attempted it, and but of course, as your research demonstrated, it was really only a small collection. But those that did, we still hold them in such high esteem. Mm-hmm. And I was very interested when you were saying about Jeff Cornish, when he was going down the line of gravestones, and I remember myself actually feeling overwhelmed when I saw Williams, and particularly Roger Bushell. Somehow or other, I was a bit overcome by his, because of the story that resonates about him, his heroism, beauty and sacrifice. Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm now going to call for questions, but first a question myself, and what we might do for questions, if people would like to get onto the chat line, and so we don't have a great rush, if people just put that they'd like to ask a question in the chat sequence down the bottom of your screens, and I'll call on each of you if you have questions. The first mine, Kristen. I remember doing my own research talking to Air Commodore Keith Parsons, who was a commander of one of the bases at Stormer Command bases, and he was saying to me that he was often contacted by other commanders saying, when are you going to get some more Australians posted in, because they're very good for morale, and they seem to demonstrate a great deal of resilience. And of course there was this I suppose a bit of a cultural thing that they like to try and beat the system. And I know that's something that you brought out in your research. Did you, in doing your research, did you actually find that there was maybe that the Australians demonstrated that more in comparison to perhaps their British counterparts?
I didn't look at how the or any of the other nationalities managed captivity, but other scholars have, and resilience definitely is an important mechanism. Resilience is actually one of the major themes of my thesis, the Australian resilience. They demonstrated this time and time again during captivity. Very few faltered. If they did succumb to depression or low moods, they had a lot of mechanisms, personal and collective, which could jolly them out of it. I also looked at their post-war lives and their post-war medical histories. And again, while many men suffered severe psychological damage, some were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, some were clearly morally troubled or had suffered moral injury, they still at the same time demonstrated a resilience. They learned to manage their conditions so that even though they may have suffered, they still came out of it. And again, we can actually see this now as we have sort of lived 2020. We've had our moments of depression, we've had our moments of anger, but at the end of it, we can still laugh, and we can now start looking back on the stories of COVID. And our friends in America and Britain and Europe eventually will do the same. We've had bad times, we've had tragedies, but we're going to create a story of resilience because most of us got through it. And that was the same with the Australian prisoners of war.
Yes, thank you, Kristen. Now, I've just got a question from, first question from Adam Lunny, please.
Good morning. Hello, Kristen.
Hello, Adam.
Thank you, and congratulations on achieving your PhD.
Thank you.
In relation to, I guess, the Pacific theatre and the European theatre, there was some conflict between air crews, the Pacific guys, I guess, thinking that Europeans had it easy. They could go to a pub and have a beer at lunchtime and then shoot down a couple of Messerschmitts in the afternoon. Was there any similar conflict or disagreement or, I don't know, maybe even jealousy between the prisoners of the Pacific and the prisoners from Europe? Since the Great Escape, there's so much myth and glory built around it compared to the suffering under the Japanese.
Well, one of the arguments of my thesis is that the Australian airmen created a narrative, what I call a fit and well narrative. They put a lot of energy into showing themselves, their families, Australia, how fit and well they were, even the men from Buchenwald, when they came back from Australia looking in terrible condition, that they still presented an image of fit and well. What that resulted in was that when the prisoners of the Japanese came home, who were in such terrible, terrible state, no matter what condition the European prisoners were, they looked better, fit and healthy as they had propagated. Ultimately, that created two classes, if you like, of prisoners of war.
Yeah, that was my thought. Yeah.
Who had it easy,
Mm.
and the prisoners of Japan who had a terrible, tragic time. As I discovered in my research, both classes were just as likely to suffer some kind of psychological damage. The legacy of war lasted a very long time, regardless of where you were imprisoned. But the prisoners of Europe did not have that recognised. And in fact, they ended up deferring to the greater tragedy of Japanese prisoners. And we institutionalized it in society when it took us so long to recognize captivity as being a tragedy. Prisoners of the Japanese received compensation before prisoners of Europe. So it wasn't so much a jealousy based on, well, you had a cushier time. It was a perception created by the Australian prisoners of Europe that they had a cushy time, even though they didn't.
Yeah, jealousy was a bad word. It's just all I could think of at short notice. But yeah, there's certainly two groupings rather than you are all prisoners and you all suffered.
Well, interestingly, like some of the Australians did join the Ex-Prisoner of War Association. Some of them enjoyed the collegiality of it, and a common link of captivity, despite the different circumstances of captivity. But some of them didn't, because they could not identify with the Japanese experience. They considered their own experience less tragic. They believed that society considered that their experience was less tragic.
Excellent, so, thank you.
Different ways of the disparity being enacted.
Thank you, Adam. That was a great question to ask and very thought-provoking, actually. I'd now like to call on Dion Mikowski. Dion, please, your question.
Thank you. And thank you, Kristen, and congratulations on achieving your PhD.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. And I just wanted to ask, in the process of researching Stalag Luft III, did you also come across some, I guess, stories from other camps that maybe you weren't necessarily chasing, but sort of came into the story, into the picture? And did those give you an impression that the lived experience of the prisoners was fairly similar, what you're writing about, apart from maybe the Great Escape, but generally speaking, was the same in most camps?
I only looked at an Air Force camp, but some of the men had been in army camps. So I did look at their broader captivity experience. So I was able to bring it in. Lived experience in the army camps was a bit different. They had a different hierarchy within which they were operating. But generally, the British did establish their own organisation. So that was similar through it. As in any places, you're going to have a disparity of experience based on the nature of your captors. Some men were bashed more in other prisons. At Lambsdorff, there was a so-called shackling incident where men, as a retaliation, they were shackled together for periods during the day. That didn't happen in Stalag Luft III. I felt that Air Force prisons were generally not leniently run, but recognized that the Germans recognized more the affiliation with Air Force men, and that's going back to that kind of concept of the brotherhood of air. So yes, they had to carry out the rules, but there was more of a recognition of Air Force experience and respect. Other scholars have found a different experience of the identity of captivity, the identity of a prisoner. And this, I think, comes from the fact that they were looking mainly at soldiers. Soldiers seem to more become adapt the identity of a prisoner. I am a prisoner of war, and this is how I behave. This is my identity. But the airmen of Stalag Luft III, and it translated again through the British, because the Australians didn't come up with the word Kriegi. It was an Air Force adaptation quite early in the piece. They very much were still active airmen on duty. So that was different. They identified as airmen right from the beginning, whereas army men tended to become, that they identified more as prisoners of war. And I couldn't see army guys actually use the word Kriegi, or unless they had perhaps been in, they had mixed with Air Force characters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like now call on Dan Ellen for his question, please, Dan.
Hi, again, fantastic paper and congratulations. Well done. Hi. I'm really taken by the way you've looked at the language, and you just said again about them calling themselves Kriegis and owning that identity, and being active participants and maintaining this idea of masculinity and taking part in the war as much as they possibly could. I'm just wondering how you balance that use of language with the terms that you use towards the end of the paper, with them, them being, well, one seeing escape as a sport, and then you ended the paper with them calling themselves naughty boys. I'm just wondering how you balance those two different contrasting uses of language.
Well, naughty boys, I guess, is actually almost going into RAF speak. They called themselves naughty. They called themselves boys. So yes, we are identifying with a broader RAF kind of language. There was right through their letters, and that the language of belonging. They did talk about wizard food, discovering the gen, that sort of thing. I guess I can't really comment on a disparity of that sort of language, but certainly if you go back to Jeff Cornish, when he was talking about his own niggles of guilt, what would I say? He was speaking in the present tense because he was in interview. But he was the fact that it was the present tense very much indicated that he had gone back to that moment in his mind. So he was still sort of at that time when he was squibbing, seeing the wife. Language was quite important when they were talking about writing about their experiences. One man, Charles Lark, drove his daughter crazy when she was writing his memoir with him, or trying to get him to write his memoir, because she said he wouldn't speak, he wouldn't give his emotions, he wouldn't talk about how he felt. But what Charles Lark did, and what other people did, if they didn't say, I felt this way, it was the power of the language which conveyed his emotion. When he was downed, he bailed out. One of his eyes was flapping about. He was seriously wounded. He landed in a lake. He struggled to swim. He used all of these very active, strong words which indicated his will to live. He didn't say, oh, I had to survive. He demonstrated through the language the strength that he was displaying in order to survive. So that was the level of analysis of language that I was going into.
Okay, smashing. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think it is really tied up with identity, and you can have. The identity is not like hats. You can have several at the same time. So
it is. There were quite a different identities, and especially too because one of the coping mechanisms I talked about the links to families, and I drew on the letters of young husbands or young lovers, and their identity as partners was equally as strong as their identity as airmen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I note there's no more questions. Does anyone like to put their hand up? Yes, and Andrew, thank you. Yeah, your question, please.
Thanks, Marianne. A wonderful presentation, Kristen. Enjoyed it immensely, as I did your book on Jack Davenport.
Oh, thank you.
And if my wife and kids take the hint, then the Clive Caldwell book will be coming my way at Christmas if they can find it.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Alexander booksellers have signed copies.
I might have to buy my own Christmas present this year and then stick it under the tree. Look,
Good on you.
within your research, I was wondering if later on, obviously toward the end of the war, when the Long March was instituted in that horrible winter of 1945, I wonder if you came across examples of this resilience and battle of wits that Australians displayed on that march as they were marched out of Poland back into Germany by the Nazi regime.
Yeah, it was not so much the battle of wits, because they certainly, because there was the threat of being shot by their German guards, but also to the idea of self-preservation. If they left the straggling column, how are they going to survive? But certainly resilience, and it was and here in a lot of ways there was the group resilience, the group protectiveness. One of the things I do talk about very strongly is how the group operated for the benefit of the group, and nowhere was that really as clear as on the forced march. They moved together in their little groups. They would help people. I mean, one of the most beautiful stories that I heard was of 3 of the Buchenwald boys. One was failing terribly, and he just collapsed. And he said, "Look, leave me." And the other 2, they wouldn't have anything of it. They were actually crew members. They had gone through all of this terrible experience. They picked him up and dragged him along, and eventually they all came home. But it was and they even, you know, made the most of their circumstances when they stopped at night. You know, they would beg, borrow, and steal food if they could, and that they would collectively cook it. They would share it. They would huddle together for warmth. There was still very much a sticking together. There was an element of selfishness, and that's something that I do talk about through the thesis. There's a continual interplay of altruism and self-interestedness. Some scholars found that there was an essential selfishness on the march. Some of my Australians, they flagrantly stole food from Germans when perhaps they didn't need to, because many of the householders that they passed through would give it to them. But when they wrote about it, it was kind of cheekily, and you know, we did this, and it was actually reinforcing the fact that they had demonstrated right through what I call Kriegi ingenuity, and it was an extension of their Air Force attitude, in that, you know, that they had to make the most of their situation. So what was interesting, but generally there was a very strong resilience and that need and the drive to get home.
Yes. Have I got time for one more quick follow-up, Marianne?
Yes, certainly, Gwen. Yeah.
Kristen, in some of my surname's not very common, Wangler, and I actually thought in some of my Bomber Command research, there's got to have been a German night fighter pilot, you know, Oberstleutnant Wangler or something like that. Anyway, much to my surprise, 2 A Wanglers cropped up that served in the Royal Air Force, and I've traced them back to our common ancestor in the mid 1800s. Where I'm going with this, though, there was a flying officer A Wangler in Stalag Luft III, Lancaster pilot, and I've been trying to trace. He obviously took part in the Long March, returned to the UK, changed his name. I'm assuming having a Germanic name post World War II was an issue. As Marianne will attest, I've spent a fair bit of time in the National Archives up in London, and also in the reading room at the RAF Museum. I've come to a bit of a dead end trying to trace you know, what happened to him on the Long March. Have you got any advice, or could I reach out to you at a later date and have a discussion?
It's probably better to send an email, then I can sort of see it.
Yes.
I can see if he's on any of the lists that I have, but certainly if he got back to the UK, he would have filled out a post-liberation debrief, and they are available in some form. So you would be able to get something from that.
Yes.
Not the forced march is a generalized term, but it was different for different groups.
Yep.
And they certainly didn't march the entire time. You know, they marched a bit, went on a train, marched a bit more, stayed in a camp for a while. So paths did diverge. But yeah, it might be better to send me a note, and then I can see what I've got.
Marianne, I have a question. Richard Honus speaking. Could I ask Kristen a question? And that is, I haven't seen the film called The Great Escape for some years, but in The Great Escape, in what really happened at the prison camp, was a motorcycle used? And if so, what brand was it? Do you know?
I'm not into motorcycles, and there certainly wasn't a motorcycle at Stalag Luft III. I look at the Great Escape film as fiction. I don't think terribly highly of it, and I won't really comment on it. But certainly it's a fiction, and so is the motorbike.
Thank you.
Sorry, Richard.
May I ask a question?
Yes,
Hello, John.
Hello, Kristen. And look, good morning, everybody. And I have a horrible feeling that in Brisbane, Queensland, we still are running under the opposite of what people in the south may be doing, which is daylight saving, because I came to this Zoom meeting about 20 minutes ago, and I get the impression it's all over. Is that fair comment, Kristen?
It's over.
Yeah, okay. Well, then, apologies. I read 10 a.m. and took it literally. So here's my question. I've missed the presentation. I'm hoping you are going to put it out in some form of written hard copy or whatever that I can access.
Well, Marianne has recorded it, so hopefully
Yes.
I will get the link and I'll be able to share it.
So, Richard, I suppose to answer you, it's David Fredericks here.
Yes,
what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing the recording with Peter Dunn from the Oz at War website, and Peter will host it from there. So it'll be accessible from Peter's website, from his Facebook group, and then I'll probably end up re-hosting that link into other groups such as the RAF Memories, etc. So we will get it out there.
Thanks, David.
As long as somebody sends me a link, I can share it.
Thanks, Kristen.
thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think you'll all agree that that was a terrific presentation. And I know I, for one, are really looking forward to your book, your published book, Kirsten, and it'll be a great read. And it's no doubt that, you know, even 78 years after the event, after, you know, the Great Escape and the stories of Stalag Luft III, they still resonate. The service and sacrifice and those stories and the gallantry still resonates with us today, and we draw inspiration from it. So thank you very much. I've now been given instructions to hand back to Group Captain Fredericks. I better obey the rules and thank you all.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Right. I now have it on recording that Marianne's going to obey the rules, so I'll make sure I save that one for posterity. Firstly, I just want to thank everyone for your contributions this year. These Zoom sessions have proved very, very successful. I should take my hat off to Peter Dunn, because if plagiarism is the best form of flattery, we've copied the work you do through the AHSA, Peter. So thank you very much. And mentioning Peter, during the course of this, we've locked in the first 2 presentations for next year. So we're not going to start up until the first Friday in February, and it'll be Peter Dunn, first cab off the rank. So Peter will be presenting on the topic, is that a zero over Brisbane? and it's the story of the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, which included RAF and WAAF, who operated out of the heritage-listed Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane, where they rebuilt a Zero, an Oscar, and a Tony, Japanese aircraft. So thank you very much, Peter, for volunteering. And 10 o'clock, or for those in Queensland, 1846, being the year, not the time. No. So there'll be 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time on the 5th of February. Then on the 5th of March, we have Adam Lunny. Adam has put his hand up to come back and do another presentation for us as well. I won't unveil his topic yet. We can do that in February. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and thank you very much for making these Zoom webinars so successful. And it's great to have such a group of people who are interested in not only Air Force history, but being members of the Friends of Air Force History and Heritage Network. So to everyone, Merry Christmas and looking forward to a more normal 2021. Remembering that 2021 is the centenary year of the Royal Australian Air Force. So it'd be great to have you all on board helping us to commemorate our very, very important year. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Happy Christmas, everyone.
Congratulations, Kristen.
Bye.
Everyone.
Kristen,
Thanks once again.
congratulations, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well done,
Bye.
Kristen.
Kristen, you're looking wonderful.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Bye, people.
Goodbye. Merry
And to
Christmas.
Chuck Henry, if you're still there, I hope I see you again and we don't have to wait another 33 years.